the day Chester Crawford took the blame for something Lillian Monroe had done. The sun was beating down so hard on the town of Caldwell, Kansas, that the dust in the streets seemed to shimmer like a mirage. And not a soul in that sweltering August of 1878 could have predicted that a single moment of inexplicable sacrifice would knot two lives together in ways that neither of them would fully understand for years to come. Lillian Monroe had arrived in Caldwell just 3 weeks prior, riding in on the afternoon stage from Wichita with nothing more than a battered carpetbag, a set of determined brown eyes, and the kind of quiet resolve that people only develop after they have survived something that should have broken them. She was 22 years old, sharp as a new blade, and running from a life in Wichita that had grown too small and too suffocating to breathe inside of. Her father, a man named Harold Monroe, had made a name for himself as a whiskey distributor who drank more of his own product than he ever sold. And after her mother passed from a fever in the spring of that same year, Lillian had packed what she could carry and made a decision that felt equal parts courage and desperation. Caldwell was a cattle town sitting right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, a place where cowboys came in off the drives looking for a hot meal, a cold drink, and a few days of something resembling civilization before turning right back around and heading south again. It was loud, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous, but it was alive in a way that Wichita had stopped being for Lillian a long time ago. She had secured work at the Golden Spur Saloon, not as one of the painted ladies who worked the upstairs rooms, but as a cook and a waitress for the dining room attached to the back of the establishment, a modest enterprise run by a stout widow named Edna Calloway who had a no-nonsense attitude about her business and a surprisingly tender heart beneath the gruff exterior. Chester Crawford, on the other hand, had been in Caldwell for nearly 4 years by the time Lillian stepped off that stage. He was 28, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that he kept too long, and the kind of sun-weathered hands that told you he had never once been afraid of honest labor. He worked as a ranch hand out at the Dillard Spread, a decent-sized cattle operation about 6 miles east of town, but he rode into Caldwell on most Saturday evenings to collect his thoughts, share a drink with whatever cowpunchers had come in off the trail, and enjoy a proper meal that did not involve beans cooked over an open fire. He was the sort of man who did not say much, but meant every word he did say, the kind of man who held doors open without thinking about it and remembered the names of people others forgot. The cowboys who worked alongside him respected him. The townspeople trusted him, which in Caldwell in 1878 was not something that could be said about just anyone. The first time Chester laid eyes on Lillian Monroe, she was carrying 2 heavy plates of roasted beef and potatoes across the dining room of the Golden Spur, moving with the kind of focused efficiency that made her look like she had been doing it her whole life, even though she had only been at it 3 weeks. He had come in for supper on a Saturday, taken his usual corner table, and was halfway through a glass of water when she swept past him so close that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap, and he found himself watching her longer than was polite before he caught himself and looked back down at the grain of the wooden table. She noticed him too, though she did not let on. She had learned early in life that noticing things quietly was safer than noticing them out loud. The event that changed everything between them happened on a Wednesday afternoon, which seemed wrong somehow, because dramatic things in a place like Caldwell usually happened on a Saturday night when the whiskey was flowing and tempers ran hot. But that Wednesday in late August was when Sheriff Roy Prout came storming into the Golden Spur with his deputy at his heels, and a face like a thundercloud, looking for whoever had stolen 3 bottles of expensive rye whiskey from the locked storeroom of the Cattlemen's Exchange next door. Lillian knew the moment she heard the sheriff's boots on the floorboards that she was in trouble, because she had taken those bottles. Not out of greed and not out of recklessness, but because the night before she had found old Pete Dawson, who swept the floors at the Exchange and slept in a shed behind the livery stable, lying sick and shaking and feverish in the alley, and the only person she had been able to find at that hour who had any knowledge of medicine was a traveling doctor named Whitaker who was passing through on his way to Dodge City. And Dr. Whitaker had told her very plainly that the only way to keep Pete from dying of the infection eating at his leg was to clean the wound with strong alcohol and keep the fever from taking hold, and he needed more whiskey than Lillian could afford to pay for on her salary. She had broken the small window latch on the exchange's storeroom, taken 3 bottles of the rye that was sitting nearest to the window, and used every last drop of it in the middle of the night to help Dr. Whitaker save Pete Dawson's life. Pete was alive because of what she had done, but that did not change the fact that she had stolen, and Roy Prout was not the sort of sheriff who was inclined to hear extenuating circumstances before he made up his mind about a person. She had been standing at the back counter when the sheriff pushed through the dining room doors, and she could feel the color draining from her face. Edna Calloway was standing right beside her, and Lillian knew with a sick certainty that if she lost this job, she had nowhere to go and no way to survive in Caldwell. The fear of it was like a stone dropping through her chest. Chester Crawford happened to be there. He had come in mid-afternoon for a cup of coffee, because one of the other hands at the Dillard spread had ridden into town with him to see the saddle maker, and Chester had some time to kill before they rode back. He was sitting at a table 2 feet from the counter when Sheriff Prout walked in. The sheriff addressed the room at large, his eyes moving from face to face the way a man looks when he already suspects someone specific, but wants the pleasure of watching them squirm. He described the missing whiskey, the broken latch, and the fact that he had reason to believe someone connected to the Golden Spur was responsible, given that the exchange shared a wall with the saloon's back storeroom. Lillian opened her mouth. She did not know exactly what she was going to say, but she knew she was going to say something true, because she was not by nature a coward, and because the secret was already pressing against her ribs like something that needed out. And then Chester Crawford stood up from his table, set down his coffee cup with a calm and deliberate hand, and said, "It was me, Sheriff." The room went so quiet that Lillian could hear the fly buzzing against the window glass. Roy Prout turned his sharp eyes on Chester with the particular look of a man who had not been expecting that answer. "Come again." "I said it was me," Chester repeated, and his voice was so even, so completely without performance, that even Lillian's mouth fell open slightly. "I broke the latch on that storeroom window last night. I took 3 bottles of the rye. I'll pay the exchange back for every cent it cost them." Prout studied him for a long moment. Chester met his gaze without flinching, and whatever the sheriff saw in those steady dark eyes made him decide the matter was settled, because Roy Prout was not a man who liked complications, and a voluntary confession with an offer of restitution was the cleanest outcome a Wednesday afternoon theft investigation could produce. "You'll pay double, Crawford, once for the whiskey and once for the damage to the property." "Yes, sir," Chester said. The sheriff left. His deputy followed. The door swung shut behind them, and the murmur of conversation gradually returned to the room as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Lillian stood at that counter unable to move for a full 10 seconds, staring at Chester Crawford's back as he sat back down and picked up his coffee cup as if he had just remarked on the weather. She walked over to him with her hands clasped together so he would not see them shaking. "Why did you do that?" she asked, low enough that only he could hear. He glanced up at her with those dark, unremarkable eyes, and there was nothing in them that looked like heroism or agenda. He just looked like a man who had done something practical. "Because you were about to say it was you," he said, "and," he turned the coffee cup in his hands, "and you'd have lost your job over it." "You could lose yours," she said. "Mr. Dillard won't want a thief on his spread." "I'm not a thief," Chester said simply, "and neither are you, but one of us needs the job more than the other can afford to lose it." She did not know what to say to that. No one in her 22 years of life had ever made that kind of calculation on her behalf without being asked, and the sheer unexpectedness of it left her standing there like she had forgotten the words to a language she had been speaking all her life. "I'll pay you back," she finally managed. "Every cent of what Prout demands from you." Chester looked at her with what she would later come to recognize as one of his rare half-smiles, the kind that lived mostly in the corners of his eyes. "You don't have to do that." "I'm going to," she said, and she meant it with the full weight of herself. He simply nodded, as if her determination was a reasonable and logical thing, and went back to his coffee. She walked away on unsteady legs and stood in the kitchen for 5 minutes staring at the wall, and the question that would spend years circling inside her mind began its very first rotation. Why would a man she had barely spoken to sacrifice himself for her, without hesitation, without theater, without even seeming to want credit for it? Chester did not lose his job. When he told Thomas Dillard what had happened, the rancher looked at him for a long beat and said, "That was either the most noble thing I've heard in a year or the most foolish." And Chester had said, "Probably some of both, sir," and Dillard had let the matter go with nothing more than a shake of his head and a deduction from Chester's wages to cover the debt. Lillian began paying Chester back the following Saturday. She had saved up a portion of her wages for the week, wrapped the coins in a small square of cloth, and waited until Chester came in for supper. She set the cloth on the table in front of him without preamble. He looked at it, then at her. "Lillian," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and the sound of it in his voice did something unexpected to the space between her ribs. "That's $4, she said. "I'll have the rest to you within the month." He did not argue, which she respected. He tucked the cloth into his vest pocket without counting it, which she respected even more, and he ordered the roast beef supper and a cup of coffee, and she brought it to him without additional fanfare. But she lingered at his table a few minutes longer than she had to, and he seemed to understand that she was trying to make conversation without quite knowing how to start it. And so he asked her where she was from, and she told him about Wichita and her father and the stage ride to Caldwell, and he listened the way Chester Crawford listened to everything, which was to say fully, and without the restless look of a man waiting for his turn to speak. She asked him where he was from, and he told her about growing up in a small town in Missouri, about coming west at 19 with 2 other young men who had both since returned home, about the way he had ridden into Caldwell on a cold November morning in 1874 with everything he owned in a bedroll and no particular plan beyond finding work and keeping himself fed. "Do you like it here?" she asked. He thought about that with the genuine consideration he gave to most questions. "I like the sky," he said finally. "It's bigger out here than it was back home. Some mornings I ride out before sunup and just watch the light come in, and it feels like the whole world is just getting started." She was not expecting poetry from a ranch hand with dust on his boots, and the surprise of it made her smile for the first time since she had arrived in Caldwell. "I felt something like that on the stage ride down from Wichita," she said. "The way the land just opens up and goes on forever, like you could be anything out here, because nobody from back there can see you." He looked at her then with a kind of quiet recognition, the way one person looks at another when they realize they have just said something that maps exactly onto a feeling they have carried alone for a long time. He did not say anything, but he did not have to. She went back to work. He finished his supper. But something had changed between them. Some small invisible door had been opened, and Caldwell being the close and busy and noisy town that it was, it proved impossible not to walk through it. Over the following weeks, the conversations grew longer, and the silences between them grew more comfortable. Lillian discovered that Chester had a dry wit that he deployed so sparingly that when he said something funny, it caught you entirely off guard. He discovered that she had strong opinions about almost everything, from the price of flour to the ethics of the cattle trade to the quality of coffee being served in establishments that really ought to know better, and that she stated those opinions with a directness that was refreshing in a world where women were generally expected to offer their thoughts sideways, if at all. September came in cooler than August, which was a mercy, and the drives were winding down for the season, which meant the cowboys who usually crowded the Golden Spurs dining room were thinning out, and Lillian had more time to breathe between tables. She used some of that time in Chester's corner when he came in. She finished paying off his debt on the first Saturday in October. She set the last few coins on his table with a small, satisfied click and said, "That's the last of it. We're square." He looked at the coins and then at her, and something shifted in his expression, something subtle that she filed away in the back of her mind and did not quite know what to do with yet. "We were always square," he said. "Not in my accounting," she said. He picked up the coins slowly, one at a time, and she thought for a moment he was going to hand them back to her, but instead he set them carefully in his palm and closed his fingers around them and nodded, and she understood that he was accepting not the money but the gesture behind it, the need she had to stand even with him, and that he honored that need. "Lillian," he said, and she stopped with her hand on the back of the chair across from him. "Would you walk with me sometime, when you're not working? I know there's a stretch of creek out east of town that's pretty in the fall." She had heard prettier invitations in her time, stated with more poetic flourish and considerably more confidence, but she had never heard one that felt quite so much like a man showing her exactly who he was, quietly sincere, asking for nothing more than what he was asking for. "I have Sunday afternoon free," she said. He nodded. "Sunday afternoon, then." That Sunday walk was the beginning of something that neither of them had vocabulary for yet, though both of them felt it the way you feel a change in the weather before you can see it in the sky. The creek was pretty, scattered with gold and rust leaves off the cottonwoods, and they walked along it for nearly an hour, talking about small things and occasionally not talking at all. And in the comfortable quiet between sentences, Lillian found herself studying his profile from the corner of her eye, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes moved across the landscape with genuine interest in it. And she thought that whatever he had done for her on that Wednesday afternoon was either the most puzzling thing a person had ever done on her behalf or the kindest, and she had not yet decided whether those two possibilities were mutually exclusive. The autumn deepened. Chester came into town every Saturday, and sometimes on an unscheduled Wednesday when she did not expect him, and she found that she had begun to watch for the shape of him in the doorway in a way that she refused to examine too closely for a long while. They walked along the creek 2 more times in October. In November, when it was too cold for the creek, he came in and sat at his corner table, and she came and sat across from him during her supper break, and they shared a meal together properly, side by side in the lamplight, and Edna Calloway watched from the kitchen doorway with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was moving steadily in that direction. It was during one of those November suppers that Lillian finally asked the question she had been carrying since August. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to tell me the truth." He set down his fork. "All right. Why did you do it, back in August? The sheriff, the whiskey, you didn't know me. We had barely spoken 3 words to each other. So why?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had learned by then that Chester's silences were not evasions but the genuine processing of something, the actual work of finding the true answer rather than the convenient one. "I heard Edna say once that you just come from Wichita," he said. "That you didn't have family here. That you'd been supporting yourself alone." He paused. "And I watched your face when the sheriff came in. You were about to own up to something, and the look on your face, it wasn't guilt. It was just exhaustion. Like you'd been the only person standing between yourself and disaster for so long that the idea of somebody else taking a hit for once hadn't even occurred to you as a possibility." Lillian's throat tightened. She kept her face still through long practice, but she felt his words landing somewhere deep and accurate in her chest. "That doesn't answer the why," she said quietly. "I suppose it doesn't," he agreed. "Honestly, Lillian, I can't give you a reason that would sound impressive. I just didn't think it should be you, and it could be me, so it was." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a dangerous way to live," she said. "Maybe," he allowed, "but it's the only way I know how." After that conversation, something in her unwound, some long-held tension in her that had been coiled since before she could remember, since her father had started treating her like an inconvenience, and the world had started feeling like a place that required constant vigilance just to remain upright inside of. She did not fall apart. That was not how Lillian Monroe was built. But she let herself feel the warmth of what Chester Crawford was, and she stopped talking herself out of it. December arrived with a cold snap that turned the Kansas prairie silver and gray, and the town of Caldwell pulled inward the way frontier towns did in winter, with fewer strangers passing through and more attention paid to the people already there. Chester had taken on some extra work at the Dillard spread through the winter, which meant he was busier and came into town less often, and Lillian discovered that the dining room felt measurably smaller on the Saturdays when he did not appear in the doorway. She wrote her first letter to him in December, which felt slightly absurd given that he lived 6 miles away, but he had mentioned that he rarely made it to town on weeknights during winter, and she had something she wanted him to know. She wrote it at the small table in the room she rented above the milliner's shop next to the Golden Spur, and she told him about a book she had borrowed from the Caldwell Lending Library, a collection of essays about the natural world, and how reading about the migration of birds had made her think of what he had said about the sky being bigger out here than it was in Missouri, and how she thought she finally understood what he meant because she had begun to feel it herself, this sense of genuine spaciousness. Like the walls of her life had been quietly pushed back. She sent it with one of the cowboys who was heading out to the Dillard spread with supplies. He wrote back within 3 days. His handwriting was careful and unhurried, and the letter was not long, but it said precisely what it needed to say. He had read the same book years ago and had thought the same thing about the birds, and he was glad she felt the spaciousness because she deserved to, and he would be in town on Saturday. He was. She served him roast beef and coffee, and they talked for 2 hours, and when she walked him to the door at the end of the evening, the air between them had changed in the way that air changes just before lightning, charged with something that had been building for months and was no longer willing to stay in the background. He stood on the boardwalk in the cold night air with his hat in his hands and looked at her, and she stood in the doorway of the Golden Spur with the warm light behind her, and he said, "Lillian, I think I'm in love with you." She had been waiting for him to say something, but not exactly those words, not that directly, and the simplicity of it struck her like a clear note on a bell. "I think I might be in love with you too," she said, and the honesty of her own words surprised her, because she was not a woman who said things like that easily or without full understanding of what they meant. He stepped forward and took her hand carefully, the way a man handles something he does not want to damage, and when he kissed her it was gentle and unhurried and tasted like coffee and winter air. And somewhere down the street a horse shifted in its hitching post, and a lantern swayed on the porch of the exchange, and the world kept moving exactly as it always had. But something inside Lillian Monroe, some fundamental and long-guarded part of her, quietly settled into place. Christmas in Caldwell was a modest affair, as it was in most cattle towns, but Edna Calloway put a wreath on the dining room door and served spiced cider alongside the regular menu. And Chester came to supper on Christmas Eve and brought Lillian a small package wrapped in brown paper, which turned out to be a pair of wool-lined gloves, because he had noticed that she was always cold at the door between the kitchen and the dining room. It was not diamonds or silk, but it was exactly the kind of gift that showed a person had been paying careful attention, and that meant more to Lillian than diamonds ever could have. She had made him a scarf. She was not a gifted seamstress, but she was determined, and it had taken her 3 weeks of evening work with needles that kept slipping, and the result was not perfectly even, but it was warm, and she had made it herself, and he wrapped it around his neck immediately and wore it for the rest of the evening, and she thought she had never felt quite so proud of anything as she did of that crooked gray scarf. January was hard. A blizzard came down out of the north in the second week and blanketed the whole of the Kansas prairie in a white silence that lasted 6 days, and Lillian spent those days confined to the Golden Spur and her small room above the milliner's shop, watching the snow pile against the windows and thinking about Chester out at the Dillard spread, hoping the hands were all warm enough, hoping the cattle were surviving. She wrote him a letter during the blizzard that she could not send until the roads cleared, and in it she said things that she could say in writing that she still found difficult to say out loud, about how she had not expected to feel what she felt, about how she had arrived in Caldwell expecting nothing but survival and had been handed something so much better than that, and how she was grateful for it in a way that was hard to put words to. When the snow cleared and the roads opened, she sent the letter. His reply came 5 days later, and it was the longest letter he had ever written her. He wrote that he had thought about her every day during the blizzard, that he had reread every letter she had sent him since December until the paper was soft at the folds, that working the Dillard spread had begun to feel like something he was marking time through until Saturday came again. He wrote that he was serious about her, that he did not use that word lightly, and that when the weather warmed, he would very much like to speak to her about the future, if she was willing to hear it. She read the letter twice sitting on her bed above the milliner's shop, and then she looked out the window at the frozen street below, at the familiar hard-edged outline of Caldwell in January, and she felt a warmth in her chest so complete that it was almost like standing in August sunlight from the inside. She was willing to hear it. February came and went in the particular long gray way of February on the prairie, and March arrived bringing mud and the smell of thaw and the first tentative signs of the cattle drives starting up again from Texas, the news of which moved through Caldwell the way all-important news moved through cattle towns, via gossip and prediction, and the appearance of advance scouts riding in to check the condition of the trail. The town began to breathe differently in March, with the specific energy of a place that knows it is about to fill back up with motion and commerce, and the particular chaos of cowboys coming off a long drive. Chester came to town on the first proper Saturday of March, when the mud had dried enough to make the ride reasonable, and he came in the early afternoon rather than the evening, which was unusual. Lillian saw him talking to Edna Calloway near the kitchen door, and felt the small lift in her chest that she associated with his presence, and when Edna caught her eye and tilted her head significantly toward the back door, Lillian untied her apron and stepped outside. He was waiting in the alley behind the Golden Spur, where the cooking smells drifted out and mingled with the smell of fresh mud and spring air, and he was holding his hat in both hands the way he did when he was working up to something important, and Lillian felt the charged quiet of the moment settle around them. "I said I wanted to talk to you about the future," he started. "You did," she agreed. "I've been working the Dillard spread for 4 years now, and I've saved a good portion of what I've earned," he said. "There's a piece of land about 3 miles north of here that Tom Dillard is willing to sell at a fair price. It's not much yet, just prairie grass and a claim, but there's good water and the soil's decent, and I think with work it could be something real." She watched his face as he spoke, the way he was choosing every word with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything. "I'm not asking you to take on a hardship," he continued. "I know that starting a homestead out here is hard work and there's no certainty in it, but I'd rather do it honestly than promise you something I can't deliver. What I can tell you is that I would spend every day of my life making sure you had what you needed. Not just what you needed to survive, but what you needed to be well and whole and happy." Lillian looked at him standing there in the alley with his hat in his hands and the March wind moving through his dark hair, and she thought about everything that had happened since the morning she had stepped off that stage 3 weeks after his name was not yet known to her. And she thought about what it had cost her to trust people before this, and what it had cost her to stop trusting them. And she thought about the look on his face in August when he had stood up in the Golden Spur dining room and taken something that was hers to carry. "Chester," she said. He looked at her. "Are you asking me to marry you?" he exhaled, something that might have been a laugh and might have been relief. "I am," he said. "I'm asking you to marry me." She said yes. She said it without hesitation and without conditions, and without the careful hedging she had learned to put around all the tender things. And when she said it, his face changed in a way she had never quite seen before, all that steady reserve brightening from the inside. And he stepped forward and put his arms around her right there in the alley behind the Golden Spur. And she pressed her face against the wool of his coat and breathed him in. And the question about why he had done what he had done in August was still there, still circling in the back of her mind. But for right now it could wait because she was too full of something better than questions. They were married in May of 1879, on a clear Saturday morning with Edna Calloway standing up as witness, and Tom Dillard himself coming into town to attend, along with half a dozen of the hands from the Dillard spread and a good portion of the regulars from the Golden Spur dining room. The preacher who married them was a traveling minister named Reverend Alcott, who passed through Caldwell twice a year, and who had a booming voice and a genuine warmth that made his sermons feel less like lectures and more like conversations with someone who liked you. Lillian wore the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool with white collar, and she had Edna pin her hair up with a small arrangement of dried wildflowers because fresh flowers in May in Kansas were unpredictable things. And she stood in the light-filled interior of the Caldwell Community Hall and listened to Chester Crawford say the words that would tie his life to hers. And she said her own words back to him clearly and steadily. And when Reverend Alcott pronounced them husband and wife, Chester took her face in both hands and kissed her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And the room made the particular warm noise that rooms full of people make when they are witnessing something right. The land north of Caldwell needed everything. Chester had not overstated the work involved when he had stood in that alley in March. The claim he had purchased from Tom Dillard was good land but raw land, without improvements, and they spent their first summer building in the most literal sense of the word, Chester swinging a hammer from first light to last with help from a couple of the Dillard hands who came over on their days off and got fed generously by Lillian in return. She kept her position at the Golden Spur through the summer, riding into town with Chester on the days he had business there, contributing her wages to the growing pile of what was needed for lumber and nails and glass for the windows, and the 100 other expenses of making a piece of land into something livable. By September of 1879, they had a solid 2-room cabin with a proper chimney and a covered porch, a well dug deep enough to be reliable, and the beginnings of a kitchen garden that had not fully produced yet but showed real promise for the following spring. It was not comfortable in the way that the houses in Wichita that Lillian had grown up admiring from the outside were comfortable, but it was theirs in a way that those houses never could have been, built by their own hands and standing on ground that belonged to them. And when Lillian swept the porch on October mornings with the cottonwoods turning gold along the creek bed to the north, she felt something that she recognized with a small shock of recognition as peace, genuine and unperformed peace, the first she had ever known in her life. Chester broke horses on the side to supplement the cattle operation they were building, and he was extraordinary at it, possessing the quality of patience that good horsework requires in a way that seemed innate rather than learned. Lillian watched him work from the fence sometimes on her days away from the Golden Spur, watched the careful respect he showed the animals, the way he never used force where steadiness would serve, and she saw in it the same quality that had made him stand up in the Golden Spur dining room on that Wednesday in August, the fundamental inclination toward gentleness that shaped everything he did. She had never stopped thinking about why he had done it. Not in a way that made her unhappy, because it no longer frightened her the way it had at first, when she could not understand it and so could not trust it. She understood Chester well enough now to understand that what he had done was simply an expression of who he was, and she understood who he was because She had watched him every day for more than a year in circumstances far more revealing than a single act of sacrifice. But there was still a small thread of the original question that she had never quite pulled all the way out, a wondering about what it had cost him internally, whether he had ever regretted it, what he had felt in the moment he made that choice. She asked him one evening in November of 1879, sitting on the porch of their cabin with the stars just beginning to appear and the horses moving quietly in the corral and the smell of the last of the kitchen garden coming up through the cold air. "I asked you before why you did what you did for me in August," she said, "and you gave me an honest answer, but I've been thinking about it since, and there's a part of the answer I don't think I ever got." He was quiet beside her, the way he was quiet when he was actually listening. "What was it like for you?" she asked. "In the moment, when you stood up and said it was you, what was going through your mind?" He thought about this for long enough that the first stars had fully resolved by the time he spoke. "Honestly," he said, "not much. I don't think I reasoned through it the way you might expect. I saw what was about to happen and something in me just disagreed with it." He paused. "I've thought about it since, trying to explain it to myself, and the best I can say is that there are moments when you know exactly what the right thing to do is, and the only question is whether you have the nerve to do it. And that moment I had the nerve. Did you ever regret it?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and in the cold starlight she could see the expression on his face as clearly as if it were midday. "No," he said simply. "How could I? It brought you here." She sat with that for a moment, feeling it settle into all the places where the question had been living for more than a year. "It wasn't just the job," she said quietly. "If I had confessed that day and lost the job, I would have found another way to survive. I always do, but you didn't know that." "No," he agreed. "I didn't know that, but you shouldn't have had to." And there it was, finally, the last piece of it. Not a grand philosophical reason, not a dramatic declaration. Just the simple conviction of a man who had looked at a woman he barely knew and decided, without calculation and without agenda, that she should not have to absorb the full weight of a situation that had been caused by nothing more than her own generosity and the impossible arithmetic of having no money and someone needing help. She reached over and took his hand in both of hers, and he turned his palm up and closed his fingers around hers. And they sat like that until the full dark came down and the coyotes started their conversation somewhere off in the distance. The following spring Lillian discovered she was pregnant, which arrived as news that Chester received with a stillness so complete and so full that it took her a moment to realize he was not just thinking but was actually struggling to contain something. And when he finally looked up at her, his eyes were bright in a way she had only seen twice before. Once when the first section of their fence went up straight and true, and once when she had said yes to his proposal in the alley behind the Golden Spur. "A baby," he said, as if he was testing the weight of the word. "A baby," she confirmed. He stood up from the kitchen table and came around to where she was standing and held her with great care, the way he held things that mattered, and she pressed her face into his chest, and thought that this was what the spaciousness had been making room for all along, not just her own survival, but the possibility of building something that mattered. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat was relentless, and Lillian was exhausted in ways she had not anticipated, and she had to give up her position at the Golden Spur in June because the combination of the heat and the long hours was too much, which she found harder than she had expected because she had come to value the work and the independence it represented. But Edna Calloway rode out to the homestead twice a week through the summer with supplies and conversation, and Chester adjusted everything around her comfort with the same quiet competence he brought to every problem, moving the water barrel closer to the kitchen, rigging a shade over the porch that made the afternoons bearable, learning to cook 3 dishes well enough that she did not have to stand over the stove on the days when the heat was worst. Their son was born in December of 1880 in the cabin on the prairie north of Caldwell, delivered by the local physician Dr. Harlan, who had set up a proper practice in town that year. and he came into the world in the early morning hours with a substantial pair of lungs and a thick cap of dark hair that everyone agreed was clearly his father's. They named him James Harold Crawford, the James for Chester's late father and the Harold for Lillian's father, because, whatever Harold Monroe's failures as a man had been, he had given Lillian her determination and her stubbornness and her willingness to move toward a difficult thing rather than away from it, and those were gifts worth acknowledging. Chester held James Harold Crawford for the first time sitting in the ladder-back chair beside the bed, where Lillian lay exhausted and relieved and more thoroughly wrung out than she had ever been in her life, and the look on his face as he held this small dark-haired person was something that Lillian would carry in her memory for the rest of her life, a man fully undone by tenderness in the best possible way. "He looks like trouble," she said from the pillow. Chester looked up at her with something that was all the way a smile, not the half version she was used to. "Good," he said. "He's going to need to be." The homestead grew in the way that homesteads grow when they are worked by people who understand that the land requires the same patient respect that Chester had always given horses and people and everything else that mattered to him. By 1882, they had expanded the original cabin with a second bedroom and a larger kitchen, had a respectable herd of cattle and a good string of horses that Chester was breeding carefully, and had planted an orchard of fruit trees along the north fence line that would take another decade to fully produce, but that Lillian tended with the kind of long-game faith that she had learned from watching Chester, who was always planting things for the future. James Crawford, as he was known, grew into a boy of enormous energy and curiosity, who was devoted to his father in the way that small boys can be devoted, following Chester around the ranch from the moment he could walk steadily, demanding explanations for everything, and beginning to ride before he was 3 years old on a gentle old mare named Bessie, who had the patience of a saint, and who seemed to understand that her job was to deliver this particular small person safely back to the fence, no matter what he decided to do on her back. Lillian watched them together, father and son, and thought about how different James Harold Crawford's childhood was from what hers had been, how different from what Chester's had been, given the quiet things he had mentioned over the years about his own father's difficulties, and she was grateful every day for the space and solidity of what they had built together on this flat Kansas land. In the fall of 1882, her own father appeared. Harold Monroe arrived in Caldwell on the afternoon stage from Wichita, looking considerably older and more diminished than Lillian remembered, and the news of his arrival reached her via Edna Calloway, who sent word out to the homestead because she thought Lillian deserved some warning. Chester was the one who rode into town to find out what Harold wanted, because he had been in Caldwell that day checking on a horse deal, and because he was the kind of man who considered meeting a difficult situation head-on preferable to waiting for it to come to you. Harold Monroe, it turned out, was in poor health and had run through whatever money he had managed to save over the years, and had come looking for his daughter without any particular plan beyond finding her. He was not threatening or confrontational. He was old in a way that went beyond years, beaten down by a life of choices that had mostly not served him well. And when Chester brought him out to the homestead in the wagon that evening, the man who stepped down from the seat was not the loud and difficult father that Lillian had left behind in Wichita, but something smaller and quieter and considerably more honest. Lillian stood on the porch of her home with James Harold Crawford on her hip and looked at her father in the yard below, and she felt things that she had not expected to feel, things more complicated than the anger she had been carrying and more merciful than the fear. And Chester stood quietly behind her with his hand on the small of her back, which was all the support she needed to stay standing exactly where she was. She and her father talked for 2 hours that evening, while Chester put James to bed and made coffee and did not interfere. Harold Monroe said he was sorry, not in the elaborate and emotional way of a man who wants something, but in the flat and factual way of a man who has finally run out of reasons not to be honest. He said he knew he had failed her. He said he was not asking for anything except to see that she was all right. And he said she was the best thing that had come from his life, that whatever she had made of herself out here was entirely her own doing, and that the most honest thing he had ever done was probably not getting in her way when she decided to leave. It was not a redemption. It was not a storybook reconciliation. But it was true, and true was what Lillian had always needed from him. And she told him that he could stay in Caldwell if he wanted to, and that she would not close the door on him if he showed up at her table sober and steady. She was not promising him everything. But she was not turning him away either, and the relief on Harold Monroe's face at that slim middle ground was something that she filed quietly away in the same place. She kept the things Chester had said to her in the alley in March, as evidence of what honest words between people could do when they were finally spoken. Harold Monroe stayed in Caldwell. He found modest work doing odd jobs around town, and lived in a boarding house and was sober more often than he was not, which was more than Lillian had been able to count on from him at any point in her childhood. Chester treated him with a civil decency that Lillian had not asked him for but had expected, because it was simply what Chester did. James Harold Crawford eventually acquired a grandfather, a somewhat weathered and imperfect one, but present and willing to tell stories about the old days in Wichita, and Lillian decided that imperfect and present was worth something that absent and idealized never could be. The question about Chester in August 1878 came back one more time in 1883, not as something that troubled her, but as something she wanted to make fully whole. They were sitting by the fire on a January evening, James asleep in the back bedroom, the wind coming hard out of the northwest the way Kansas wind did in winter, and she had been reading a letter from a woman in Wichita she had gone to school with years ago. A letter full of small domestic news that was pleasant and meant nothing much. And when she set it down, she looked across the fire at Chester, who was mending a piece of harness with the lamp pulled close. And she felt the whole shape of their life together, around her like something solid. "You remember what you told me once," she said, "about there being moments when you know exactly what the right thing to do is, and the only question is whether you have the nerve to do it." He looked up from the harness. "I remember. I've been thinking about that," she said, "and I think it goes both directions. I think there are moments when you know exactly what is true about a person, about whether they are someone you can trust completely, and the only question is whether you have the nerve to believe it." He was watching her with those steady dark eyes. "I want you to know that I believe it," she said, "about you, about what you did and what you are. I think I've known it for years and kept a small piece of the question back out of habit, because holding a question is safer than letting the answer in all the way, and I want to let it in all the way." Chester set the harness down on the table very carefully. He stood up from his chair and came across the room to her, and he sat beside her on the hearthrug and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her for a moment in the firelight. "I've been all the way in since August of 1878, he said. She laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that started in the chest and filled the room, and he smiled that full smile that she would never stop being grateful for, and she leaned her forehead against his, and outside the wind kept its cold argument with the Kansas prairie, and inside the fire was warm and steady, and the man beside her was real and true and entirely hers. Spring of 1884 brought a second pregnancy, and with it the particular tired joy of knowing what was coming, of having done this once before and survived it and received something extraordinary on the other side. Chester was steady in the way that he was always steady, practical and attentive, and capable of making her laugh on the days when the waiting was the hardest part. James Crawford, now 3 years old, had strong opinions about everything, and wanted to know with great urgency whether the baby was going to be able to ride a horse right away. And Chester explained with a straight face that there would be a brief waiting period, and James received this information with skeptical resignation. The second child arrived in September of 1884, a girl with Lillian's brown eyes and a temperament that suggested she had inherited the best stubbornness from both sides. They named her Clara Edna Crawford, the Clara for no one in particular except that it was a name that suited her immediately, and the Edna for the woman who had given Lillian her first honest chance in Caldwell, and who received the honor with the brisk dismissal of a woman who was moved, but would not be seen to be moved. Clara Crawford turned out to be a different creature entirely from her brother, quieter and more watchful but no less determined, a child who observed things from the edges of rooms before committing to them, and who had, by age 2, developed the ability to communicate entire paragraphs of meaning through a single well-placed look that Lillian recognized with a shock of amusement as entirely her own. The homestead had become something real and established by the mid-1880s, a working cattle and horse operation with a reputation for quality animals that brought buyers from as far as Wichita and occasionally from points beyond that. Chester had a particular skill with breeding that Tom Dillard himself came to consult on occasionally, which was a quiet reversal from the days when Chester had worked the Dillard spread for wages, and he received the old rancher's questions with the same absence of performance that characterized everything he did. Lillian had returned to work at the Golden Spur for a period after James was born and before Clara arrived, not because they needed the money as desperately as they once had, but because she valued the work and the company and the specific aliveness of a busy dining room, and because Edna Calloway's health had been declining slowly since 1882, and Lillian had found herself filling in more and more of the operational decisions that Edna could no longer manage with her former energy. When Edna Calloway passed quietly in the winter of 1885, after a short illness that the doctor said was simply the body deciding it had done enough, she left the Golden Spur dining room to Lillian Monroe Crawford in her will, written out in her plain, firm hand, with a note attached that said only, "You know how to do this. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Lillian sat with that will for a long time in the lawyer's office in Caldwell, and then she rode home to the homestead and told Chester, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with moments when he was not surprised at all. "Of course she did," he said. "I don't know if I can run it properly while also running the homestead," Lillian said. "You can," he said, "and I'll help where you need it. We'll work it out." They worked it out. By 1886, the Golden Spur dining room was Lillian's in every practical sense, renamed the Monroe table by popular consensus, even though the name above the door still said Golden Spur, and it had a reputation in Caldwell as the best food in town served by the most direct proprietor in the territory, and it was one of the few establishments in that part of Kansas where the women who worked as server and cook earned a fair wage and were treated with consistent respect. Because Lillian Monroe Crawford had very clear opinions about how people ought to be treated and the authority now to act on them. Harold Monroe died in the spring of 1887, quietly in his sleep in the boarding house where he had lived for 5 years, not causing anyone any trouble, which had been the best he could do at the end, and which Lillian decided was worth mourning even if the full complicated weight of what he had been and not been was mourned alongside it. She attended to his arrangements with Chester at her side, and at the grave she said nothing formal because she did not have formal things to say, but she stood there in the March wind and thanked him privately for her stubbornness and her willingness to move toward difficult things, which she was increasingly convinced were the two qualities that had made everything good in her life possible. Chester said nothing at the graveside. He stood close enough that his arm pressed against hers and held her hand all the way back to the wagon, and that was more than enough. James Crawford turned 7 in the December of 1887 and showed every indication of becoming the kind of man that his father was, not in any surface way, but in the deepest structural way, curious and patient and fundamentally interested in other people. The sort of child who listened when the old-timers at the fence talked about the old trail days, and who could sit still for a story the way he could not sit still for almost anything else. He had Chester's dark hair and Lillian's brown eyes, and a laugh that belonged to no one but himself. And he was at ease with horses by 7 in a way that Chester said he had not managed until he was considerably older. Clara at 3 was already a personality that could fill a room, and she and James had the particular relationship of siblings who are genuinely fond of each other and fight constantly in the specific way of people who know exactly how to get under each other's skin. Lillian managed the household with the same organized practicality she brought to the Monroe table, and Chester managed the ranch with the steady attentiveness that was simply his nature. And between the two of them, they had built in Caldwell, Kansas, on the flat and beautiful and enormous prairie, a life that was real and full and deeply, solidly good. In the evenings, after the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet and the fire was low, they sat together in the way that they had learned to sit together over nearly a decade of marriage, comfortable in the silence and comfortable in the conversation. Two people who had found in each other the specific thing that made the world feel navigable. And Lillian looked at Chester Crawford across the firelit room and thought about a Wednesday afternoon in August of 1878, when a man she did not know had stood up and changed the direction of her life with 5 words and no discernible agenda. And she thought that she had spent years trying to understand why, and she had arrived at the understanding that some things do not reduce down to reasons, that some things are simply what they are, and that what Chester had done was simply an expression of what Chester was, and what Chester was the best thing that had ever happened to her. She told him that, one evening in 1888, in almost exactly those words. He looked at her across the fire with those dark, steady eyes and said, "You're the best thing that happened to me, Lillian. Before you, I was just existing on that prairie. I had work and I had sky, and I didn't know I was missing the whole center of it." She stood up from her chair and crossed to him and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And outside the prairie went on forever under the enormous Kansas sky, and inside the fire crackled and the children slept, and everything was exactly as it should be. The years that followed were the accumulation of all the ordinary and extraordinary things that a life contains when it is being lived fully. The Monroe table continued to grow in reputation, drawing travelers off the cattle trail who had heard by word of mouth that a stop in Caldwell meant the best roast beef in Kansas, and a proprietress who did not tolerate nonsense from anyone. Chester expanded the horse breeding operation with careful and considered steps, building relationships with buyers across the state, and earning a reputation that served the ranch well. James Crawford grew toward manhood with the particular quality of grace that belongs to young men who have been loved consistently. And Clara Crawford grew toward young womanhood with the particular quality of purpose that belongs to girls who have watched their mothers build something from nothing with their own hands. In 1891, when James was 10 and Clara was 7, and the homestead was fully established, and the Monroe table was as much a Caldwell institution as the livery stable or the post office, Lillian discovered that she was pregnant again, which arrived as a surprise at 35 but a welcome one, and Chester received the news with the same quiet fullness that had characterized every moment of genuine significance in his life. This time it was another boy, born in the winter of 1892, arriving in the world with his father's patience already apparent in the way. He regarded the ceiling of the cabin bedroom with calm consideration, rather than the outraged howling that had characterized both James and Clara's entries into the world. They named him Thomas Edward Crawford, the Thomas for Tom Dillard who had given Chester his start and who had long since retired and handed the spread to his son, and the Edward for no particular reason except that it suited him. Thomas Edward Crawford grew up in the easiest circumstances of the 3 Crawford children, arriving into a household that was stable and prosperous, and full of a love that had been tested over years, and had emerged not just intact but deepened. And the ease of his circumstances showed in his disposition, which was sunny and sociable in a way that was entirely different from both his older siblings, and that made the house louder and warmer and perpetually more surprised. By 1895, with James 15 and Clara 11 and Thomas 3, the Crawford homestead north of Caldwell was not just a successful cattle and horse operation, but a landmark, the kind of place that had become part of the fabric of the community, known for its quality animals, and its open table on Sunday afternoons when neighbors came from as far as 10 miles to share a meal, and whatever news the week had produced. Lillian ran those Sunday tables with the same organizational precision she brought to everything, and Chester moved through the gatherings with the specific ease of a man who is at home in the deepest sense of that word, not just in a place, but in a life. He and Lillian were still the kind of people who reached for each other's hands without thinking about it, still the kind of couple who could communicate entire conversations in a glance, and who laughed at things that only made sense to the two of them. And the young cowhands who worked the Crawford spread and witnessed this with some regularity tended to regard them with a mixture of respect and the specific wistfulness of people who have not yet found what they are looking for, but have at least seen what it looks like when found. James Crawford, at 15, was already nearly as tall as his father and possessed of a seriousness about horses that exceeded even Chester's at the same age, and it was clear to anyone who watched him work the animals that the Crawford breeding operation was in good hands for the next generation. He also had his mother's directness, which occasionally startled people who encountered it for the first time but which Chester privately regarded as one of the finest things in his son, the willingness to say the true thing in the right moment. Clara Crawford, at 11, was reading everything she could find, having consumed the Caldwell Lending Library's collection, with an efficiency that had the librarian ordering new stock specifically on her behalf. And she had announced to her family that she intended to become a teacher, which Lillian had received with the specific pride of a woman who had educated herself out of necessity, and who understood the full weight of what it meant for her daughter to reach for that as a deliberate choice. In 1897, Lillian's friend from Wichita, the woman whose letter she had been reading that January evening by the fire in 1883, came through Caldwell on a journey west with her husband, and they spent 2 days at the Crawford homestead and were fed generously and shown the horses and introduced to the children. And Lillian's friend pulled her aside on the second evening and said, "You look different from how I remember you. You look like someone who has arrived somewhere." Lillian thought about that for a long time after her friend had gone, sitting on the porch in the warm summer evening with Chester's voice coming from the corral where he was talking to James about the new foal, and she decided her friend was right. She had arrived somewhere. She had arrived at the life that had been possible all along, waiting just past the edge of what she had known in Wichita, on the other side of a stage ride and a Wednesday afternoon, and a man who had stood up in a dining room and said 4 words that changed everything. Chester came up to the porch when the light had gone gold and sat beside her in the second chair, and they watched the prairie sky do what it always did in the evening, turn into something so beautiful it made the chest ache. "Your friend seemed happy," he said. "She did," Lillian agreed. "She said I looked like someone who had arrived somewhere." He turned his head to look at her, and she could see in his face exactly what she had always been able to see there, the particular warmth that was specifically for her, the same warmth that had been there since December of 1878 when he had kissed her in the doorway of the Golden Spur, and she had tasted coffee and winter air. "You have," he said. "We both have." She reached over and took his hand, and he turned his palm up the way he always did, and the children's voices carried in from somewhere on the ranch, James calling to Clara about something horse-related, Thomas's lighter voice asking a question that nobody was apparently answering quickly enough to suit him, and the horses moved in the corral, and the cottonwoods rustled in the creek bottom, and the enormous Kansas sky went on forever. And Lillian Monroe Crawford thought that this was what she had been moving toward all her life, even when she had no idea that it existed. This specific fullness, this warmth and solidity and love that had started with a mystery and had answered itself slowly and completely over 19 years of living alongside the steadiest man she had ever known. "Chester," she said, I'm glad it was you." He was quiet for a moment in the way that he was quiet when something had landed squarely. "So am I," he said, and then, after another pause with the dry precision that she had never once stopped finding endearing, "I was always going to be glad it was you, even before I knew it." She laughed, and he smiled, and the evening came down full and warm around them on the porch of the house they had built on the prairie north of Caldwell, Kansas. In the summer that had followed the spring when Chester Crawford had stood up in a dining room and changed both their lives with the quiet and simple conviction that she should not have to carry it alone. The question she had spent years circling had its answer, complete and whole and settled in the marrow of her bones. He had done it because he was who he was, and who he was had been made for who she was, and together they had made something that would outlast both of them and the children they were raising, and the land they were tending, and the love between them that had started in confusion and sacrifice, and grown into the truest and most enduring thing that either of them had ever known. The sun went down over Caldwell, and the prairie turned dark, and the stars came out in the great Kansas sky, the way Chester had once told her they came out, so numerous and so close that they seemed to press down toward the earth. And the Crawford homestead settled into the night with its horses and its cattle and its 3 children and its 2 people who had found each other against all reasonable expectation, and who went on finding each other every day in all the small and ordinary and extraordinary ways that 2 people can, when they are brave enough and patient enough and honest enough to keep looking. The last thing Lillian Monroe Crawford thought before she went inside that evening was that she hoped James would find it, and Clara would find it, and Thomas would find it, this specific thing, this truest thing, and that they would recognize it when they did, not as something spectacular and immediately obvious, but as something quiet and steady and absolutely certain, the way Chester Crawford had always been, from the very first moment he had stood up and said, without hesitation, that it was him. And she hoped that whoever they found would deserve them completely, the way Chester had always deserved her, and the way she, in her best and bravest and most honest self, had always deserved him. The door of the cabin swung open, and Thomas's small, earnest face appeared in the light. "Mama, Papa, James says the foal is going to be a champion, and Clara says that is not a scientific statement. Can you come explain it to them?" Chester stood from his chair with the unhurried ease of a man who has nowhere else to be, and Lillian rose beside him, and they went into the warmth of the house together, and the door closed behind them, and the prairie night held everything quietly and completely, the way it always had and always would.